Well, with that, I think, we're a minute or two here afternoon. We'll kick off as people keep introducing themselves in the chat. I'm Peggy Sue Amihiti, and I work for the City of Hopkins. I'm also the Vice President of the APA Minnesota chapter. I am kind of exiting the Diversity and Equity Committee as a co-chair, so still kind of keeping these lunch and learns moving. We do these the first Thursday of every month. So mark it on your calendar. There's always something here. They're always free, which is a great way to earn your CMs. Today, we have Amelia Vose and Katie Cashman from the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy talking about adding climate and environmental justice into the EAW process. So really excited to turn this over to them. But again, we are recording this and we will have this after the fact on the APA YouTube website. And then, I would guess Amelia and Katie would be kind enough to share their slides out after as well. And then finally, just a thank you to Santec for continuing to sponsor these webinars. So with that, Katie and Amelia, thank you so much. I'll kick it off to you.
All right, thank you.
Katie, do you want me to start with the opening slide?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, welcome and thanks so much for having us. I'm Amelia Voss, and I'm here with my colleague, Katie Cashman, and we're both from Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and we are excited to talk with you about some of these new processes and frontiers in environmental justice and climate change and environmental review. So just so you know a little bit about who we are, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is a nonprofit organization in Minnesota. We've been around for almost 50 years, and we have staff that consists of attorneys, legislative advocates, policy specialists, and communication staff. So we work in all three branches of government. We bring legal cases, we certainly advocate at the legislature, and then we also do a fair bit of interacting with our state agencies. And our mission is to use law and science to protect Minnesota's environment. And I'm an attorney at MCEA. I work a lot on clean energy work before the Public Utilities Commission, and also do quite a bit of work in environmental review. And I'm here with Katie, who is our project coordinator at MCEA.
All right, thanks, Amelia. Yeah, so before we get started on our presentation today, I want to acknowledge, where we're living. I personally live in Minneapolis, so I'm living on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people. And the Anishinaabe people, or the Ojibwe people, have also lived here, resided here for a long time. So this map, I really like looking at it and coming back to it with the Dakota names of different special places around the Twin Cities. And I like to bring particular attention to Rote, what is now called Pike Island, which is the meeting of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers, and that is the ancestral or spiritual birthplace of the Dakota people. So I invite everyone to check out this map by Marlena Miles. All right, and then our outline for today, we'll first talk about what the EPB Climate Change Pilot Program is and what's going on with it, and Amelia's perspective on how this came to be and why it's important. Then we'll talk a little bit about how environmental justice can be brought more into environmental review than it currently is. And then finally, just ways for city planners and people on this call to get involved with this work. So I'll turn it over to you, Amelia.
Perfect. And Katie, I'm getting a little bit of feedback behind your voice. I don't know, but while I'm talking, you might be able to troubleshoot that. So I think most of you on the call are pretty familiar with the environmental review process, but just for those of you who don't engage in it every day as kind of a refresher. So environmental review is a legally required process, both federally and in the state of Minnesota. And it's the process by which projects that need to obtain a local or state permit provide information, especially with an eye towards the public, about their potential environmental effects. And basically the process involves filling out a form. In Minnesota, it's the Environmental Assessment Worksheet, or the EAW form, that contains details about those potential environmental effects. Of course, environmental review has to be done before a project can receive its permit, because the process is all about understanding the potential consequences of a project before a decision to allow the project to go forward is made. So I like to think about the process as look before you leap, and also a way for our state and local decision makers to use information to make better decisions about what projects they're going to locate in their communities and how to design those projects so they can coexist with the natural environment in a productive way. And the ultimate question that we're looking at in environmental review is, does the project have a potential for significant environmental effects? And so just keep that phrase in mind, because I'm going to talk about that more as we go on. You can go to the next slide. And I just wanted to clarify up front, there are two different kinds of environmental review. There's the environmental assessment worksheet, and then there's a more in-depth process that looks at more effects and alternatives to the project, and that's the environmental impact statement, or the EIS. And today I'm really talking about environmental review using the environmental assessment worksheet. So I just wanted to make that clear that all of the things that I'm going to talk about related to climate are about how it's working with the EAW. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So kind of interestingly, right now, projects that go through the environmental review process don't really have to consider their climate impacts. The only projects that are required to consider their climate impacts right now are those that receive an air permit. And so that leaves out a lot of different types of projects that have greenhouse gas emissions and even significant greenhouse gas emissions from considering their climate impacts during environmental review. And this is especially true with projects that come from those sectors in Minnesota that we haven't made good progress in decarbonizing. So for example, the agricultural sector has a ways to go in reducing emissions, and we're not looking at greenhouse gases currently from large animal feedlots, for example, or new building projects or new highways. And so the current EAW form we have in Minnesota asks questions about, what are the noise impacts of a project? What might the odor impacts be to neighbors? But there isn't a consistent question about climate, which I think kind of highlights the real need to change and update that form, because we know that climate change is certainly a much bigger concern than noise, odor, nuisance impacts. So right now, that means that most of the projects that are getting a permit in Minnesota are getting those permits without, considering the quantity of emissions that they're going to produce, and without considering opportunities that might be really low-hanging fruit to reduce those emissions. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So when we're thinking about that question of, does a project have a potential significant environmental effect, I just kind of wanted to highlight the ways that we've already started to see climate change affect Minnesota, to kind of drive those two questions together, link those two questions together. So just last year, we saw so many climate-related impacts, especially during the summer in Minnesota. And this graphic is a picture of the Drought Monitor, and it shows where Minnesota was in July of last year. And you can see the red is extreme drought, the orange is severe drought, the kind of light orange color is moderate drought, and then yellow is abnormally dry. So as we all remember, we had pretty severe drought conditions. At that point in July, 72% of Minnesota was in severe drought. You can go on to the next slide. So it didn't get better over the summer. If you remember, by September, this is what the drought monitor looked like. And so we now have the deep red, exceptional drought, more extreme drought, still a good chunk of the state in severe drought, and lots of moderate drought and abnormally dry. You can go on to the next slide. And this is just a picture of the western part of Gooseberry Falls comparing June to July, where that water really dried up because of the drought that we experienced last summer. You can go on to the next one. And then, of course, that drought also caused impacts into how people used our water resources in Minnesota. A lot of boating and recreational impacts or activities were impacted by that drought. You can go on to the next slide. And then last summer, we also saw the wildfires in Canada and in northern Minnesota that went on and really restricted the ability of people to go into the boundary waters for certain periods of time. And you can go on to the next slide. And of course, that affected air quality throughout the state. So this is a chart of the air quality index in 2021. And you can see there at the end of July that there's a spike because of those wildfires where the air quality went into the unhealthy range for all people, not just for sensitive groups. You can go on to the next slide. So based on all of that, I think it's pretty clear that we're already seeing the effects of climate change in Minnesota, and it's really time for us to start considering climate as part of our planning and as part of the environmental review process. So recently, the Environmental Quality Board, which is the state agency responsible for overseeing the environmental review process, began a process to update the environmental review program to include climate analysis on that EAW form. And so they have actually now created a new EAW form that includes various questions about climate, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a second. And that new form is currently in a pilot program, and the intention of that pilot program is to help both municipal governments and state agencies that perform environmental review, or those responsible governmental units, RGUs, to get familiar with this new climate analysis and to work in a group with other municipalities and state agencies who are also trying to do this climate analysis, and to kind of share learnings, get feedback on how that analysis has gone in the EAW documents, and just kind of try and learn best practices about how to do climate analysis for different types of projects. So that pilot program is currently ongoing and is set to go through September of this year. And then the Environmental Quality Board is going to be taking a vote in December of this year about whether to take that piloted EAW form with a climate analysis and make that the EAW form that everyone uses, not just those municipalities and state agencies that are in the pilot. So we could see this new form with climate analysis incorporated rolled out to the rest of the state as early as 2023. You can go to the next slide. And just to give you a little bit of idea about what the climate analysis looks like on this new EAW form, it asks for a greenhouse gas quantification of the pilot's greenhouse gas emissions. There is not an exception for projects that have, or that believe they'll have a small amount of emissions. Everybody is asked to count their emissions. And projects are also asked to consider possible mitigations. So there's a question that asks to describe any mitigation that was considered by the project to reduce their emissions, what effect that mitigation would have, and why that mitigation wasn't selected if it wasn't chosen to be incorporated into the project. So for example, was it just too cost prohibitive, or for some reason not readily available to that project? And then really importantly, there's questions about climate adaptation and resiliency, looking at how we can better design projects to withstand and be successful in a changing climate with, those drought conditions that we just looked at, with increasing extreme storms and flooding, with increasingly high temperatures. Are we thinking about that in our project design and making sure that our projects are resilient in that way? And then the last part of the analysis is looking at the Next Generation Energy Act, which was passed in 2007. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but it sets a state goal of reducing emissions 30% by 2025 and then 80% by 2050. And so this question asks how a project is kind of anticipating those greenhouse gas reduction goals and aligned with achieving those kinds of deep greenhouse gas reductions in the state. You can go on to the next slide. So a little bit more about the pilot. The state agencies that perform environmental review are all participating and are using this new EAW form now in the environmental review that they perform. And then local units of government were invited to participate. Participation is voluntary. And there are currently 93 people who are enrolled in the pilot, and that consists of 25 local responsible governmental units, meaning 25 municipalities, 7 state agencies, and then 30 consulting firms. And registration is still open. So for those of you who are interested in this, I would strongly encourage you to sign up for the pilot program and to get involved. Part of the pilot, in addition to using this new form with climate analysis, is that there are these monthly collaborative forums for people who are in the pilot to receive both technical presentations about how to do a good climate analysis, and then also just share with each other, best practices or challenges that they've had trying to perform a climate analysis as part of environmental review. You can go on to the next slide. And so, just to kind of close this out, these on the left are the expected impacts of climate change in Minnesota. And we've talked about quite a few of them that we're already starting to see. And a lot of these, I think, are going to really impact municipalities and local government decision makers in a unique way. And I think municipalities are really going to be on the front lines of a lot of these effects because, it's going to impact housing stock, city infrastructure, tourism, drinking water supplies, those people whose jobs really require them to be outside. It's going to affect ecosystems. And so I think municipalities are unfortunately uniquely situated to have to deal with a brunt of these impacts, but also uniquely situated to start planning for them now, especially by considering climate during the environmental review process. And just to give some idea of the benefits of that, like one of the things that we've been talking about is, how can we look at the design of a project? Let's say it's a new high school building, for example. Are there design features that we can implement now that are going to be less expensive to do now in the construction phase versus later? So that could be, building that building with sufficient electricity service to eventually have that building be fully electrified, or it could be fully electrified now. That could be ensuring that the roof is, prepared to someday have solar panels. But there's lots of different climate mitigations and adaptations that are these kind of low-hanging fruit that can be built into project design on a project-by-project basis that are so much less expensive and so much easier to do now than they will be in the future. So looking at all of that during the environmental review process is a huge asset. And we're excited that the EQB is starting to move environmental review in that direction. But I would certainly encourage all of you to participate in that pilot program. And I'm just trying to keep a little eye on the chat. But we will have a slide. Katie has a slide at the end that will show you how to sign up for the pilot. But it's just an easy link on the EQB's website. And so now, Katie, I think that was my last slide. Is that right? Yes. So now I'd love to turn it over to Katie to talk about kind of the next frontier in environmental review, which is bringing environmental justice considerations into the environmental review process as well.
Yeah, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. I didn't really have a chance to troubleshoot that because I didn't want to disrupt the flow. Amelia, is it okay?
It's better. The closer you are to your screen, the better it is.
Okay, so I'm gonna stay close and hopefully everyone can hear me. So what does the climate change analysis and environmental review have to do with environmental justice? And that comes to the question of, what is environmental justice and how does this interplay with climate change? So one definition that I really like comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who is known as the father of environmental justice. The people most impacted by environmental challenges must speak for themselves and must be in the room where decisions are being made. And he was part of the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991 in Washington, D.C. Leading documents out of this discourse. So some of the principles that I thought really relate to what we're talking about include number one, the right to be free from ecological destruction. Number two, that public policy must be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from discrimination. Three, the right to ethical, balanced, and responsible uses of land. Four, the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, and implementation. So currently, environmental review does not require an environmental justice analysis, but this pilot program for climate change is a really good opportunity to start bringing in this more social conversation into environmental review, because climate change is exacerbating environmental justice concerns and environmental hazards that communities are facing in Minnesota. So through an environmental justice lens, we can look at social inequities in our spatial landscape in Minnesota. So one tool to help us do this is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's environmental justice map that defines EJ communities by income level and percentage of the community that is people of color. So their definition is that at least 40% of people reported income less than 185% of the federal poverty level, and or the community is made up of 50% or more people of color. And just for reference, the 185% of the federal poverty level is about $25,000 per year for a family of one, 33 for a family of two, and so on. It's incrementally larger after that, for depending on the size of your family. So this map, as you can see on the left, it does include a lot of federally recognized tribal areas. So that's something to be really particularly aware of, that the tribal areas in Minnesota are largely environmental justice communities. And then on the next slide, I'll show the Twin Cities metro area, which does also have a lot of environmental justice communities. So this map that MCEA has is a screening tool that can stimulate more conversation about the need for improved community engagement and evaluating adverse impacts of projects that fall within these communities. So right now, the environmental review process doesn't require an analysis of cumulative impacts in the way that we understand it in environmental justice. So cumulative impacts refers to a total burden from chemical and non-chemical stressors that a community faces. So compounding impacts, for example, from transportation, living by a highway, as well as an industry. So having both the transportation pollution and the industry pollution cause cumulative impacts on the community. And this is getting talked about more and more about the health impacts of pollution within the frame of the cumulative impacts. So part of MCEA's work is working with a coalition called the Frontline Community Protection Coalition to pass legislation that would require a cumulative impacts analysis for permitting and environmental review. So in the Twin Cities, you can see a lot of areas are categorized as EJ communities. And this has a lot to do with the history of racial segregation in the Twin Cities and the redlining housing policies. And I'll get into that in the next couple slides. But I want to point out this study from the Minnesota Department of Health and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that they put out in 2015 that shows that in the metro area, zip codes with the largest percentage of BIPOC residents had more than 5 times the rate of asthma emergency room visits related to air pollution than majority white areas. So this is the impact of compounding pollution in communities. In 2015, there were 1,588 deaths attributable to air pollution in the Twin Cities metro area. And that's a lot. So the heart and lung diseases are being affected by PM2, so particulate matter, fine particulate matter, as well as ozone, which is another air pollutant. And these are, importantly, these are not climate impacts. These are not greenhouse gases, but they are other pollutants that communities are being impacted by now. And this tool, I wanted to bring up that it also shows, if you zoom in closely on the communities, you can see the language diversity. So I would just encourage people to check out that screening tool. Just search MCEA EJ map, and you can look in on your community and see interesting air pollution information and language information, income information, etc. So going back to the impacts, the environmental impacts that communities face, environmental justice communities face. A lot of this in the Twin Cities comes from the redlining policies that were codified in the 1930s. And now you can see the impacts, spatially of those policies, such as the urban heat island effect. So formerly redlined neighborhoods are on average 5 degrees hotter in summer than areas that weren't redlined. So considering that extreme heat is a climate change impact, this is going to be worsened because of the redlining policies and the spatial segregation that we still have in the cities. This map also shows a direct correlation between tree canopy. So formerly redlined neighborhoods have less tree cover today than areas that weren't redlined. And that's directly correlated with communities of color. So there is a relationship between racially segregated neighborhoods, tree canopy, and heat, urban heat impacts, the urban heat island effect as well. So this all culminates also in a life expectancy analysis. So life expectancy in neighborhoods that were formerly redlined is lower than in neighborhoods that were not redlined. So these are some of the environmental justice concerns that communities are facing and ways to analyze the relationship between health and pollution. So what are the best practices for bringing environmental justice into environmental review? Well, the experts, the attorneys at MCEA, as well as experts from the EPA at the federal level, are saying that early and meaningful community engagement is essential because every environmental justice community is unique and will have unique concerns. So early means before the plans for the project are made, before people are hired, before decisions are made, that communities should be engaged in talking about the concerns and the needs of the community and how a project would impact that. And communication should be done both digitally and also in person for people who don't have access to digital forms of communication. So through the newspaper, through word of mouth, through the radio, through meetings in community centers. And communications are really important. So that leads to the second point about meaningful engagement, that the transparency should be there about how decisions are being made, publishing the records about who was involved in decisions, how inputs were considered from different stakeholders, and who has the power and the authority to make decisions about our built environment. And then another way is to conduct this research about cumulative impacts using the screening tools, the one I mentioned, for example, or the EPA also has an EJ screening tool that's in beta mode. So I encourage you to check that out too. And then importantly, the project should be actually modified based on this information and by the community feedback, so that it's not, so the community was actually heard in this process and not just taking the information and then go along with the project as it was originally proposed. And well, in the pilot program as well, and in the climate analysis and environmental review, the important part as well is to modify the project based on climate information. So if you're analyzing that, this project is going to produce X thousand greenhouse gases per year, and there is this mitigation potential to mitigate that through, solar panels like Amelia mentioned, or installation of electrification for appliances, or by, having a better transport network nearby, that kind of thing, that the project should actually be adapted to respond to the climate analysis. So the information is actually being used to generate a better project. So ways to get involved in this work, one is to join the pilot project. And I'm actually curious to see if anybody here is part of the pilot. I think Peggy, you are. So I'd be curious to hear your experience so far. It goes until September. But also, even if not through the pilot program, responsible government units and project proposers are welcome to integrate all levels of climate and environmental justice analysis into their project documents. And then beyond just environmental review, because I know many of you are urban planners as well, is to be an advocate for climate and EJ analysis in municipal planning. So I will, Amelia, if you wouldn't mind trying to throw, I saw you have the link to sign up in the chat. But with the rest of our time today, I thought it would be great to hear from some of you about whether or not you've been part of the EQB pilot program, and if so, what have you learned, or what has your experience been like? And then secondly, if anyone wants to talk about how your municipality is looking at environmental justice and planning and incorporating that, and if you have any examples to share with the group, we'd love to hear them. So thanks, I'll leave it at that for now, and we can open up discussion.
Great, thank you, Katie and Amelia. I will just pop through the checks. There were a couple of questions here, and yes, Hopkins is participating in the pilot program. We haven't had a project that needed to do an EAW yet, so our experience has been a little limited, but it's been great to kind of see all the work that's going into really making sure that communities have the education that they need to really be informed as they go through this process. So someone kind of pointed out just like how much they loved the low-hanging fruit examples. Is that something you guys can talk a little bit more about, or does MCEA have resources for planners as we think about, sustainable development codes, or ways that we can incorporate those into what we ask from developers?
Yeah, so we haven't put together a specific toolkit that looks at across all project types. Although there are lots of good resources out there, and that may be something that we should do. But I think, for the variety of projects that go through environmental review, what's on the table varies project by project. So for the example of an animal feedlot, it's going to be looking at more agriculturally based best management practices and sequestering carbon in soil. For a residential development, it's going to be looking at opportunities, like I mentioned before, to make sure that all of the homes or apartments have electrical service that's sufficient to be ready for electrification of appliances. I know a number of our colleagues are working on doing heat pumps and electrifying their homes, and they're having to do some big, expensive upgrades to their electric panels. So things like that, I think, for bigger projects like the example I gave with the high school, looking at what are the options that you can facilitate having even greater renewable sources for your electricity. Our utility sector is doing pretty good at decarbonizing, but is there a local community solar garden that you can get part of your power from? Part of it's sustainable building materials. Part of it is the transit aspect, like Katie mentioned. If it's a new apartment building, what are the opportunities to build close to public transportation or to have electric car chargers? That's going to be a big one that is kind of forward looking now. We're not, we don't today, as we sit here in 2022, live in a time where there's electric vehicle chargers everywhere, but that's certainly going to be a big shift we'll see in the coming years. So I don't have a set list of resources, but I would encourage doing some research, on a specific project type that you have going through environmental review, because there's lots of good resources out there that are kind of these low-hanging fruit examples. And I also think, for environmental review, it's often common to work with consulting firms, and many of them have really good resources to having gone through, having done this process with a number of different projects.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a question, and it's kind of two questions here. The suggested definition of early input and involvement seems to go above and beyond any state statutory requirements. Is that the intent of the EAW performance standard being suggested? Seems like a really high bar for any specific project. And then some kind of following up on that question of early input. If this occurs before any plans are being made or what is being discussed. So if people are talking about having that input before a plan, how do you go about doing that? I think is the question there.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts, and then Katie, I'd love to kick it over to you if you have things to add. So this is a great question, and it reminds me of a point that I wanted to highlight, which is that the interesting thing about environmental review is that, we all kind of go by the EAW form, but the EAW form is actually the floor of what can be done in environmental review. And if you look at the law, the state governmental entity or municipality that's performing the environmental review, that RGU role, has discretion on a project by project basis to decide what kind of needs to happen in the environmental review process for any given project. So there's a lot of room for municipalities to say, here's the process that we're going to use to do environmental review for this specific project, knowing that you may have a project that's going to be an environmental justice area. That would be a great time to use your discretion and say, this is a project that's going to require some additional steps because it's in an environmental justice community. And I think the question about early input is a great one. I mean, I'll give a couple examples. Sometimes you may not be able to have a conversation without a proposal on the table. That's true, but we've also seen actually quite a few instances where a community knows that a property is going to be sold and is going to be up for development. And it's like the instances we've seen our times for that property was a industry-based property. It was something that was polluting, and the community really wants to reclaim that space and have it serve as, you know, a public park, a community garden, something that really gives back to the community rather than having it continue to be an industrial space. And so, you know, if you work in a community that has, you know, some kind of big land turnover that you're anticipating, if there is a opportunity to speak to the community at a local community center, you know, and kind of get their input on what they'd like to see that land be used for, I can tell you as an attorney, that's going to make a big difference in the conflict and potential litigation down the road. So, you know, it not, you know, perhaps not every project is going to require the same amount of community involvement or the same or the as early of community consultation, but there are definitely projects where that's really, in my opinion, important to consult the community, and also going to be a real time saver in terms of conflict and money spent arguing about what to do with a particular property. Katie, I'd love to hear your
Oh,
your
that's a
thoughts on this too.
great summary. And yeah, I think that it is difficult and time consuming, but it's worth it for social and environmental sustainability to put a plan together for consulting with the community. I mean, everyone should have an input on their built environment, and there's going to be conflicting ideas about how, you know, land should be used. And so thinking really deeply about how you want to approach that is really important. And I'm going to share in the chat a document from the EPA, which is guidance from 2016. So I was just skimming through it about, you know, how early is early or how early is too early. And I think it's never too early to be engaging people and developing citizen relationships with an area under development or potential development. And, you know, this article talks specifically about preliminary screening processes and developing communications even at that phase. So developing communication strategies with the community before screening, during screening of the potential project. And I would also like to hear from anybody else in the audience too, if they have an example of this and how, you know, from your experience, how it's gone.
I'll just add too, you know, most people on this call are planners, right? So you do this type of planning for a lot of things, whether that's, you know, just purely from like, what might this land use be in the future? I think it can be a little bit more of a muscle to work to expand that to thinking about how does that land use then impact the climate, and how do we plan for, you know, what that use might do and how that use might contribute or not contribute to, you know, climate change. So you definitely have to take that, like that one extra step, but it's a muscle that we all know how to use. And I agree. I'd be really curious if people are on the call or doing this, you're welcome to unmute yourself and come on video. I know it's scary, this wall of names and no videos, but you're welcome to come in and add anything. There was another question here, just kind of about working with tribes. Could you share the work that MCEA does with tribes, or how cities, or especially cities who are adjacent to tribal nations, can work more with tribes and reservations?
Do you want to take that one, Katie?
Well, I think I don't work on any cases specifically, but I know that in some of our cases for environmental review that we do work with the tribe on their contesting, I guess, projects. So whether it's Line 3 or the OSB plant proposed up in Cohasset that have impacts on the tribes, that we do support their work. And we might have like parallel legal strategy, or we might support their strategy entirely. But it's really important for MCEA to be allies and to work in solidarity with tribes and the arguments that they're making for their health and well-being. And this is, this is really important issue because they do have sovereignty as tribal nations, and they also have treaty rights on all of the land. I can pull up a treaty map as well. Treaties that were signed in the 1850s and around that era, that the tribes of Minnesota have the right to hunt, fish, and gather legally on the treaty lands. So that's a really important legal argument that we support them making as well when it comes to their opposition to proposed projects on their lands.
Yeah, and I think a big part of how we think about working with tribes is what Katie described on one of her last slides, which is just like consultation early and often, and really listening to what their priorities are and what their concerns are. So, in some of the cases that I've litigated with some of the tribal governments, in instances where it was a case that was really affecting their land, we, if it was just us in the case, we might have a different legal approach or a different priority. But, our partnership was really about listening and understanding what their priorities were and following their lead, because this was really about their home and their land. And so I think it's about early conversations, because the most unproductive partnership you can have is one that feels like it's only one in name but not in practice. And so I think a lot of conflict can happen if EJ communities or tribal governments feel like they aren't being genuinely consulted, and there aren't options to change or modify an approach based on their feedback. So that early consultation is important. Being willing to take that feedback and look at, what are possible modifications? Is there a middle ground? Just really getting their opinion and listening and trying to take that into account is, I think, one of the most important things.
Great, thank you. So there's some questions here. So one question is, I have 2 African universities in Africa, specifically in Nigeria, and we're discussing about setting up a research groups in these 2 institutes to study and implement mangrove tree multiplications as used as carbon capture and also for environmental remediations for environments that is highly polluted by crude oil and natural gas flaring. Is there any assistance from this group or any other to assist with this kind of research? I'm going to guess it's maybe a little outside of what you do at MCEA, but this person left their email. So if anyone has any resources, please feel free to connect. Another question was sort of, we haven't done any analysis like this before in terms of, I think that going back to that early engagement, really thinking about projects sort of before they happened, and how does it, where does it fall? Like where do you put it? It's because it's such a big topic. Do you have any advice on who kind of carries that?
I wish I was more of an expert in municipal government structure and how to really structure that. But I think the short answer is that it's a little bit of a group commitment, that everybody is bought in, that we're going to work on climate and we're going to work on environmental justice, and everybody plays a little bit of a part. In the instances that I can think of, part of the work is being in touch with the community and understanding who community leaders are and where the community gets their information and how to communicate to the community. Part of it is at the city council level and what projects are being approved and what's the process before those projects are being approved. Part of it's the environmental staff. And so I think it spans a lot of different people kind of working together, honestly. I know that's not a super helpful answer, but I think everybody kind of plays a little bit of a role.
I think a lot of cities are also developing sustainability program areas, like hiring sustainability coordinators and climate teams that run this area. And, there was a report put out by the 100% campaign that was authored by Dr. Kate Knuth recently that details every municipal climate action plan that exists across the state of Minnesota. And those are really great examples for municipalities about how to get climate action planning going.
Yeah, and I will say, I also think, and there was kind of a nod to this in the chat, I do think I am from Faribault, Minnesota, and even though I live closer to the cities now for my work, I still consider myself a Faribault person. That's my home. And, I think there's a ton of opportunity in smaller municipalities. And, some would say Faribault's not even that small because it's 20,000 people. To me, it was small, felt small, because they're, it's easier to really have those deep connections in the community. I think people at the city of Faribault know who in the community are kind of different leaders in both different cultural communities and in, different aspects of the community to reach out to and talk to, and so and I think a lot of cities do this, but, when they're doing their planning, they're reaching out to specific members of the community to say, hey, I know, you're really in touch with historic preservation. I know you're really, you work for the water preservation group. They really know who are kind of people from different communities to reach out to. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity in smaller communities where, you kind of know the people in your community really well to make this happen early.
Great, thank you for that. There's a lot of really good resources popping up in the chat. Just if you're not familiar.
Sorry for all the links.
No, it's awesome. I love it. Thank you.
Feel free to check them out.
And I will say, Jesse Idbo from Hennepin County had a great kind of just summary around, especially for those smaller communities, really giving this pilot a try and making sure that, when you're a smaller community, especially we feel that here in Hopkins, where you can do a little bit more because you're a little more agile. So really pushing, especially your counties, to do this work. Evan also just added that the disparate impacts we see in the maps presented by Katie are not new and begun before any of us were born. But as lawyers and planning professionals, we have current and ongoing obligations to work towards fixing them and towards justice. And that is why we're here and why we're talking about this. So thank you for calling that out, Evan. Is there any other questions that folks have for Katie and Amelia before we end today?
And I'll just add that one of the things that I work on a lot at MCEA is this process of the EQB and, paying attention to what's going on there. So if anybody wants to talk about, one-on-one about what this could look like in their community or, how to make this happen in their specific community, I'd love to have that conversation. So, or if you want more information about the pilot, any resource that I can be for folks, I would love to, I'd love to do that. I'd love to have coffee one-on-one and just chat about it.
Great. And maybe you and Katie can put your emails in the chat so that people can reach out. One last question is EJ community the correct term for us to use? What's the best way to talk about communities that are experiencing environmental injustice?
I mean, yeah, I like what you just said as well. Communities experiencing environmental injustice or communities that are experiencing cumulative pollution impacts. Yeah, any way that is bringing attention to, the impacts that different communities are facing from pollution, and recognizing that, that we don't all live, I like this quote about climate change, that we're all in this, we're all in the same sea, but we're not all in the same boat. So like we're all facing climate change, but some people have the resources to what faces the impacts of climate change, and other people don't, and that's something to be really aware of. So, as we are facing climate change more and more, that the impacts are going to be felt more, whether it's flooding or extreme heat or natural disasters by people whose land and whose property, et cetera, whose community has less resources. So I think that, environmental justice community or communities who are overburdened by pollution would be another way to say it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Katie and Amelia. There's still some chat going on here. I'll just save this last space if people want to keep chatting in the chat or want to, bring anything to you while we're still in this space. People can feel free to unmute or jump on. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here, and a big thank you to Amelia and Katie today for your time.
Thanks so much for everyone's attention. It was our pleasure to be here, and we're really happy to be invited.
Yep, great to be here with all of you, and feel free to reach out.
Katie and Amelia,